Hello watch lovers from all over the world, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian and today we have a pretty cool watch on the bench. What we're looking at is an Angelus watch from the 1950s, and it has one of the landmark automatic movements inside it, the bi-directionally. We'll get back to why that's a landmark movement. So after initially not really wanting to, the watch did start running. So that's good. And we see the hand setting works and the date change works as well. The case is pretty beat up, however, and there's a lot of scratching on the crystal. So we're going to have to fix that. Dial looks to be pretty okay, and the hands as well. So what we can see is that the case is chrome plated. And that means it's a softer metal underneath, and that's why you get these pretty deep and bad scratches. That can be fixed. Let's put it on the time grapher and see how it runs. And that's not really too great, but let's clean it and see what happens then. And with the back open, we see that it has the Felsa Bidynator movement. At first glance, viewers of the Rust Bucket Challenge might think they recognize this movement, and it's a very similar one. I mentioned initially that this movement is called the bi-directionally, and its claim to fame is that it was the first automatic movement that is wound in two directions. The automatic movement itself was invented in the late 1700s, but all until this movement, they could only wind in one direction. So this was the first bi-directional automatic movement. And it has a very ingenious way of winding that we're going to get to. For the brand Angelus or Angelus or Angelus, a little bit depending on where you come from, they were known as one of the premier chronograph manufacturers. They came out with the first chronograph with a date on it, for instance. We're also known for things like alarm watch with date, minute repeaters, and so forth. So most of the Angelus watches you will find today are chronographs, vintage, and they command a pretty high price. As with many other companies, they went bust during the quartz crisis, but they were actually revived just a few years back and are now back selling high-end watches, typically 5-digit prices, some 50,000–60,000. So for an Angelus, this is a very modest watch. Hope to have one with perhaps a 215 movement at some point. We'll see where we get. In the meantime, we took off the automatic works. And we're now going to take off the base movement. I'll talk a little bit more about the automatic works when we put the watch back together, because it's a very cool, very ingenious solution. See, there's a lot of congealed grease and oil. So it's certainly been a while since this watch was serviced. And the hair as well. Alright, so we stripped the whole train side, so we can turn the movement over to the dial side and take off the keyless works. A very straightforward and solid solution for the keyless works. There's a lot of sticky parts here. And the setting lever is very, very dirty. So we're going to clean that up as well. Before getting the movement into the cleaning machine, we're going to peg the jewel holes and also try to get off the worst of the congealed grease and oil. And we're going to also clean the pivots of the wheels. The crown wheel is on the underside of the bridge, and it is again very stuck. So no wonder this watch wasn't running too well with all this gunk everywhere. The barrel has this kind of unusual construction. A little bit the same type of construction you might find in pin pallet movements, where the barrel arbor is actually part of the lid. And it also has this automatic bridle inside the barrel. This bridle was basically the same as we have on modern automatic mainsprings. But you could have the bridle slip, and the bridle would then hold the non-automatic mainspring in place. So seeing that that is inside the barrel is also another indication that this watch hasn't been worked on for a few decades. And that's all right. It is vintage after all. For the pivots, I keep getting questions about this product. It is called Eve Flex. And you can get it in most material houses. With the movement stripped, we can then put all the parts into the basket and have the cleaning machine do some work for us. All right, with that on its way, let's have a look at the case. Because this case needs some work. And for followers of the channel, you know that I'm pretty conservative. But this case we really need to do a job on. Let's just first take the crown tube out. And we have a tool for that. For the case back, there's a really old gasket there as well. Hard and stiff. So not quite like gaskets should be. So let's clean these before we start working on the polishing. And with the case cleaned, we can clamp it up in the lathe. Very unflattering light, but that also shows how worn this case is. So we're going to even use a file to begin with to get the worst scratches out, and also to reshape the bezel because the original angles were very rounded. As you might have noticed, this case doesn't actually have a bezel. It's part of the case, and that makes it a bit more difficult to get a good result, but we'll try. After the file, we can then use emery sticks, basically sandpaper, and get a better result, and then we can polish it. For the sides of the case, we're basically going to do the same thing, but we can of course not use the lathe for that, so we're going to have to hand file it to begin with. Apologies for the shaky camera here, but if you try to bob your head from side to side in the same rhythm as I file, then it will look much better. What you can see as we get off the chrome plating and the worst scratches is that the metal underneath is kind of silvery, but with a little yellow tint. And no, it's not white gold, unfortunately. It is, however, nickel. Pretty soft material, so we can get all the scratches out and try to restore or keep the angles as they should be. And then we're basically going to do the same thing on all the other parts of the case. Given that the lugs are a little bit sharp, we use the Dremel as well to get into the corners a little bit. Before we take it to the polishing machine. And with that, the case already looks a whole lot better. Still gonna polish it a little bit more before we plate it. And if we look at the metal compared to the stainless steel back, you can see there's a definite yellow shine to the nickel. For the plating, I use this very simple setup. We first clean the case, and then we rinse it in distilled water. And then we put it into a surface activator bath. Both of these are just 15-30 seconds. And then we're going to leave it in the palladium bath for a couple of minutes. Very neat machine. And with that, the case is pretty close to finished. We're going to buff it up a little bit before we put the movement inside, but for now, looks good. Let's then also take out the scratches in the crystal. There's no black magic to this. I wish there was, but it's basically just using different grits of sandpaper to take out the scratches. And then once that is done, we can take out the last fine scratches with Polywatch. You can also use other very fine abrasives. Doesn't have to be Polywatch. But that is the last stage after all the scratches have been taken out with finer sandpaper. Then we can put the crystal back in the case. And voila. All right. Then we can start building the movement back up. We are going to put in a new mainspring, an automatic mainspring. We're also going to grease the sides of the barrel wall. This is also called braking grease. It basically makes the mainspring slip a little bit less than if there was nothing on the walls. When putting in a new mainspring like this, very important to get the bridle end into the barrel first, and then the rest will follow. Given that the barrel arbor is part of the lid, we have to press it in and twist, and then the barrel is complete. We're going to use this fixo drop to help the oil stay a little bit more put on a few of the parts. Those parts are the escape wheel, the pallet fork, and the capstones for the balance wheel. The capstones are a part of the shock settings that helps protect the pivots on the balance wheel. We're also going to reduce the friction by putting a tiny little drop of oil in the middle of the capstones. Very light oil, because the balance wheel is a light wheel that rotates very fast. If it's a heavier wheel that rotates much more slowly, typically also has much more torque on it, and then we'll use a thicker oil. So with the shock settings in place, let's see if it worked. And yeah, that looks nice. Beautiful, actually. Now we can take the balance off again and start rebuilding the movement. First thing we put in place is the center wheel. The center wheel has a little bridge on top of it, and that is to allow the seconds pinion to go through the center wheel so that we have a sweep seconds or a center seconds dial. Anywhere there is friction, we want to put a little bit of oil. And you saw what happened to this kind of oil after a long time if it's not cleaned and replaced. So that is really the reason why we typically recommend that a mechanical watch is serviced every 5 years or so. It is to ensure that the lubrication inside the watch is still working and protecting the parts instead of basically becoming a grinding paste. So we're going to follow the standard procedure. We're going to assemble the base movement first. So basically all the parts that needed to make the watch tick. And then we're going to make sure that it runs well. And after we know that, then we can put in the complication or complications, given that it's 2 on this watch, both date and automatic. The parts I'm working on here are part of the keyless works, and this is where you have the most real friction and most force. So here we use grease, and that blue grease you saw I used is especially made for the keyless works. Cool color also. Wonder if they make them in pink. Would be cool. Alright, with the keyless works fully assembled, we want to check that we can pull the crown out to set the time, and that we can wind the watch when the crown is all the way in. Basically, every time we put a new part in or a new function in, we want to test that it works. A little bit of OCD is a good thing when it comes to watchmaking. Okay, we put in the pallet fork. We're going to put a little bit of power on the mainspring, and then we can oil the pallets. It's a little bit difficult to see, but there's a small angle between the teeth and the face of the pallet stone that I'm oiling. And that little angle is enough to make the escape wheel push the pallet stone away a little bit. And that makes the other end of the pallet fork hit the balance and give impulse to the balance, and hence making the balance keep oscillating. So it's important that there's a little friction when that escape wheel tooth slides across the pallet stone. Okay, then we can put the balance in. We're also going to oil the different jewel holes where the pivots for the wheels rotate, also to minimize friction. And we'll do that on both sides. And then we can check how the watch runs on the time grapher. So what do we want to see on the time grapher? Well, ideally the rate on the left should be +3, +5, something like that. The amplitude that says 278 here should typically be between 270 and 315. The beat error that says 1.8 here should be 0 ideally, but not more than 1.0. And the last number that keeps flipping between 18,000 and 52 degrees is something called the lift angle, and we typically don't have to worry too much about that. And then you have the lines in the middle of the screen. You basically have one line for the entry pallet and one line for the exit pallet. Ideally, they should be completely straight and perfectly overlapping. But as I'm adjusting here, we see that the lines are pretty straight, but they are pretty far from overlapping, and that's because the beat error is too high. And this is an old watch, so we're going to have to adjust the beat error the old-fashioned way. If you want to understand a little bit more about how the watch actually works, the logic behind each part, then you can watch this recent video I uploaded. Let's put the balance back in and see if that helped. And that little adjustment got the beat error to 1.1, and that is fine. We're not going to try to adjust it more. And we see the rate and amplitude is just fine, so we're happy with that. Then we can start assembling the automatic works. As mentioned, this was the first movement ever that made it possible to wind the watch in both directions. So when the rotor swings, it can of course either swing to the left or to the right basically, or what we call clockwise or counterclockwise. And all watches before this one could only wind the movement when the rotor swung in one direction. And the way they solved it is pretty cool. I think it's a very clever way of doing it. First of all, we have these two wheels that we just put in. And then we have this lever that basically swings from side to side and is directly connected and always connected to the rotor. Let's put on the plate first and we can see how this works. So there's a pinion at the underside of that lever that's always in mesh with a corresponding wheel under the rotor. And when the rotor swings counterclockwise, it will press the lever upwards here. And then the pinion on the lever will mesh with the upper wheel under the plate, which is again in contact with the lower wheel, and that will drive the barrel. When the rotor swings clockwise, then that little lever swings downwards in the picture and directly meshes with the lower wheel under the plate and directly against the barrel. So it's a very ingenious solution, very simple, but it's basically also the way modern bi-directional winding systems work. For instance, Rolex with the 2 reverser wheels is actually exactly the same principle, just a little bit differently implemented. For the calendar works, it's a very basic implementation of that. There's no quick set whatsoever. So to actually flip the date, you have to turn the hands 24 hours around the dial. So that's a bit of a bummer. Interesting that they made this innovation with the bidirectional automatic winding, but then skimped on the date implementation. The date jumper is also very simple. It's just this little disc that's held in place. It's also not very strong, so you don't get a very distinct jump. I'm going to put some oil on it, and it's going to help a little bit. And here we can also see that if we try to turn the hands backwards, as is most often quickset type in these old movements, then the date just flips one date back and then forward again. So not too much help in that. Before putting the dial back on, let's clean it a little bit as well. The dial does have a pretty big scratch, but otherwise it's pretty nice. It's an old pie pan type dial. Now one little problem is that the date is too low in the window. We can adjust that a little bit by basically bending the dial feet. That way we move the dial a little bit up or down, and that seems to have helped. Alright, then we can put on the hands. We first turn the crown so that the date just jumps over, then we know it's midnight. And then we can put on the hour hand at 12. Just going to check that the hour hand is parallel to the dial. And then we can put the minute hand on. It's a really cool minute hand that really pops on the dial. And we're checking again. If we place the hands properly, the date should flip pretty much when the hands are at midnight. Within 15 minutes to or fro at least. And that looks pretty good. Before we put the seconds hand on, we want to clean it a little bit. It does show some corrosion. But it's all in the surface, so we can get that off. The hand is, however, a little bit loose, so we're going to tighten the collet, or the tube, if you will. We have a tool for that as well. Yep, watchmakers are tool junkies. Again, we're making sure that the hands are parallel to each other and to the dial. It's quite common, unfortunately, that the seconds hand stops in the minute hand, for instance. With the movement cased, we can put the stem back in. We also have this movement ring. Before we put the rotor on, we put a little bit of oil on the rotor post as well. And then this rotor has this little lock that is pretty nifty. So there's no screws involved in that. Final thing is for the case back. I'm going to put in a new gasket. We're lucky enough to find one that fits. Before we put in a nice strap and see the watch on the wrist, let's also see if we can recognize the difference between before and after. All right, I think we found a strap that makes the minute hand pop quite well as well. It's a pretty cool watch in my humble opinion, and the case looks a lot better. Hope you liked this video. If you did, then clicking like and subscribe will certainly help the channel. We'll be back with another video shortly. Until then, ta-ta.